The women's rights movement in America was a significant turning point in American history that not only gave women the right to vote, but also paved the way for women's freedom in America. Before 1848, women had limited rights. They were restricted from voting, owning property, keeping their paycheck, and even having custody over their own children. But this all began to change when Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha C. Wright, Mary McClintock, Jane Hunt, and many other courageous women took a stand against the rights of injustice they and other women of the U.S. faced. Elizabeth and Lucretia organized a convention in Seneca Falls, New York on July 9th and 20th of 1848, marking the start of the women's suffrage movement. At the convention, they decided it was time to end the injustice women were facing. After 2 days of discussion, the 68 women and 32 men in attendance signed the Declaration of Sentiments written by Elizabeth. This declaration set protests and agendas for the movement to follow. It declared that women should be equal to men, stating, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women were created equal," writing women into the narrative of the Constitution. They would go on to make speeches, petition Congress, and pressure officials of the government to realize that women should be able to vote. Then, 2 years later, they would hold a second convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, which would become a yearly event that became known as the National Women's Rights Convention. They ended their meetings in 1869. The main goal of the suffrage movement was for the right to vote, but it was also to show the world that women should be treated as equals, not inferiors. Many of the women who started the women's rights movement with a dream of freedom would unfortunately never get to see it fulfilled, but their sacrifice and bravery would always be remembered. In 1851, Elizabeth Stanton would go on to meet Susan B. Anthony, a fellow activist for women's rights. They would become close friends, and Anthony and Scranton were both powerful leaders in the battle for equality. Their voices and ability to lead would shape the suffrage movement. They would go on to co-found the American Equals Rights Association, that believed everyone should have equal rights in America, despite their color, gender, or race. They never stopped fighting for women's suffrage. Unfortunately, they, like many others, would never get to see their hopes fulfilled. Elizabeth would die in 1902, and Susan would follow 4 years later. Although they died before the 19th Amendment was passed, their voices and leadership would continue to fuel the suffrage movement. The movement would take many blows after their petition and amendments would be denied by the government over and over again. However, suffragists did not give up. They decided their freedom was worth the time and the risk, so they took varying approaches to achieving the right to let women be able to vote. Some groups following the strategy of passing acts in each state. The first being in 1869, when Wyoming Territory, the first part of America to give women the freedom to vote. After becoming a state in 1890, it would continue to give women that freedom, and many other states would follow in pursuit of Wyoming. While other groups such as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage and the National Women's Party, also known as NWP, used tactics to band together and re-propose this amendment straight to the government, rather than going state by state. These groups were more experienced than previous groups. As a part of the advocacy efforts, the NWP generated publicity, public interest, and applied pressure on legislators to promote the passage of federal amendments to the U.S. Constitution that would guarantee the women right to vote. In 1912, on September 8th, a suffrage campaign took place in Sagamore Hills, where former President Teddy Roosevelt spoke at their campaign. Roosevelt was always in support of women's rights. He testified about wrongful women labor laws in New York. He allowed women to attend Bull Moose Party conventions. and he was one of the few politicians who favored women's rights. His alliance towards the women's rights movement would make a huge impact. The suffrage movement continued to grow despite what most politicians wanted. Woodrow Wilson, the current president at the time, who was opposed to women's rights for the majority of the movement, received backlash when the National Women's Party and the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage started picketing the White House, calling out Wilson for what they believed was cowardice. They believed the president was on their side. They might be able to pass the amendment. This was one of the strategies they used.
Along with using several tactics, such as holding open-air demonstrations, distributing pamphlets, organizing parades, circulating petitions for suffrage, mounting billboards along public highways, and organizing suffrage speakers' nationwide automobile and train tours. These groups also used several more aggressive tactics, such as picketing the White House and the congressional office buildings. Many were imprisoned and would be force-fed after starting a hunger strike and refusing to eat. In the end, it was a political shift that took place when New York adopted women's suffrage in 1917, and President Wilson changed his position to support the amendment and joined his daughter, Jessie Woodrow Wilson Sayre, in the journey to equality. The House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment on May 21, 1919, and the Senate followed 2 weeks later, with Tennessee being the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920. The amendment had reached its final hurdle of being ratified by 3/4 of the state. On August 26, 1920, Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified the ratification, forever altering the American electorate. Despite the long, difficult, emotional, and dramatic campaign for women's suffrage, ratification did not guarantee full enfranchisement as many had believed it would. Voting rights for African Americans and other minority women remained a distant dream, decades after it had been promised. The discriminatory state voting laws prevented many women from voting long into the 20th century, which led to more protesting. Organizations used past techniques that helped ratify the 19th Amendment and won aid in allowing African Americans and other minorities of women to also have the right to vote. The ratification of the 19th Amendment has shaped and molded the U.S. into what it is today. The 19th Amendment didn't give women equality or even freedom, but it started America towards the realization that women were more than simple-minded. The power of those voices showed people that women were more than just objects. The women's suffrage movement is a movement in history that will always remind us that anyone can make a difference. With the 19th Amendment and the advancement of our country, women do not just have the right to vote, but they also have the right to freedom. Freedom to have a job, to own property, to seek education, and to be who they want to be. The suffrage movement can show people that we can make a difference. Women can be senators, police, mothers, and activists. We have the freedom to be almost anything we set our minds to. The sacrifice and determination of every woman and man who stood up for freedom made a difference. If it weren't for the dedication to change the world, it would be a very different place.